Okay, moving on to the next segment of today's show. There was a question I heard the other day that I had to think about for a little bit, and after I heard it, I decided, you know what? This is such an interesting and fascinating conversation that I wanted to talk about it on today's episode of the Zach Kroll Sports Podcast. And that question is this, as we get into a little bit of the NFL for the first time today, and that is this. Which quarterback is under more pressure next season? Is it Baker Mayfield of the Browns or Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills? And I think the interesting thing about this question is that both of these quarterbacks, I believe, are under a decent amount of pressure going into the 2020 NFL season, but I just think it's two very different situations and it's two different kinds of pressure, even though both are under a lot of pressure. So let's break it down. We'll start off with Baker Mayfield of the Cleveland Browns. And we all know everything that went down in Cleveland last year for the Browns. Going into the season, it looked like they were ready. They had a really talented roster, but unfortunately, it didn't really work out as Baker Mayfield just really wasn't good. Odell Beckham was never on the same page as his teammates. Freddie Kitchens was an awful coach. There was really no adult in the room. The offensive line stunk. The defense wasn't great, and the Cleveland Browns ultimately went 6-10. And I do think that pressure does start at the quarterback position, no doubt about it. Baker Mayfield is a former number one overall pick, and you saw his rookie year that he did have the ability to lead the Cleveland Browns to success, and he looked good in the back end of that season, won a bunch of games, and then that's when the Browns decided to bring in all that talent like they did, like Odell. They had Jarvis Landry that year as well, but they also brought in Olivier Vernon on defense, Kareem Hunt on the offensive side of the ball. So we all know the amount of talent that the Cleveland Browns had, but it all starts at the quarterback position. I think Baker Mayfield, and I've spoken about this on this show before, is really out of excuses. Last year, we all know, Freddie Kitchens, he was just an awful, awful head coach. Well, they bring in a new coach in Kevin Stefanski, and I think he deserved the job. I think we don't really know how good of a coach he is. It's hard to judge, but I do know this: he did make Kirk Cousins look really good in Minnesota while he was the quarterback of the Vikings, and it's going to be hard for him to be as bad as Freddie Kitchens was last year. And even with a horrible coach in Freddie Kitchens, the Cleveland Browns were able to win 6 games, which doesn't sound like a lot, but for a franchise like the Cleveland Browns, big picture, that's better than usual. They also really fixed up their other problem last year, which was their offensive line. They had a lot of trouble protecting Baker Mayfield last year, and when you're a starting quarterback, you know that if you don't have protection, then that's a no-no. You're in big trouble, and that, I believe, is a big reason why Baker Mayfield really couldn't do anything last year. But their new GM, Andrew Berry, did decide to fix that problem. He really did improve the offensive line for Baker Mayfield by bringing in free agent Jack Conklin from the Tennessee Titans to play one tackle, and then in the first round, they drafted Jedrick Wills from Alabama. I still believe the Cleveland Browns are one of the top 4 or 5 most talented teams in the National Football League. I would also make the argument that we've had a lot of discussions before about, after Baltimore and Kansas City, who is the best team in the AFC? So who is the third best team in the AFC? And a lot of people are going to say Buffalo, and I'm not saying I would take Cleveland as that answer, but I would also say this. I think you could definitely make a case that the Cleveland Browns are the third most talented team in the AFC. I also totally understand that coaching right now is an unknown with Kevin Stefanski. He's never coached an NFL game in his life. We don't know how good of a coach he is. We also know that quarterback is a big question mark. Baker Mayfield was awful last year, and he's going to be under a lot of pressure going into this season. But at the same time, what I also will say is this. Odell Beckham, yeah, he's a little bit of an oddball. He can definitely provide some distractions sometimes, but he's one of the more talented wide receivers in the National Football League. I still believe in his game. Nick Chubb, one of the most underrated players in the National Football League. That is a running back that could play for my team really any day of the week. They also bring in Austin Hooper from the Atlanta Falcons to play tight end alongside David Njoku. They also bring in Kareem Hunt. He's going to be there now for the full season, so maybe his impact for the Cleveland Browns will be a little better. So Baker Mayfield, the kind of pressure that he's under is this. The Cleveland Browns, if he's the problem. I could really see them moving on from Baker Mayfield next season and maybe seeing Baker become the next Jameis Winston. And I know that's harsh, especially for a guy that was the number one overall pick pretty recently. But at the same time, year 3 is usually just such a big year for quarterbacks. And when you look at the talent Baker Mayfield has around him, and when you look at the fact that he's out of excuses, I think you could definitely make the argument that Baker Mayfield is under a bunch of pressure this season for the Browns. Okay, and then the other quarterback I wanted to talk about during this segment, and ironically enough, he was drafted in the same draft class as Baker Mayfield, and that is Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills. And when I started off this show, I said both of these quarterbacks the segment, I said both of these quarterbacks are under a lot of pressure going into next season, but different kinds of pressure. I just spent the first half of this segment talking about Baker Mayfield and how if he isn't successful next season, and if he's the reason why the Cleveland Browns don't make the playoffs, I could definitely see Cleveland moving on from him. I don't think that is the case with Josh Allen. I think if you've listened to the show, you guys know my opinion on Josh Allen. I don't think he's awful, but I do think at some times he holds the Buffalo Bills back, and I don't think he's on the same level of ready to lead the Buffalo Bills to a long playoff run as some of the other parts of that roster. And I'll tell you exactly what I mean. Right now, we're basically, all of us are in the same boat in the sense that we believe the Kansas City Chiefs and the Baltimore Ravens are the best two teams in the AFC, right? When you look at Pat Mahomes and the weapons he has around him, they're also the defending Super Bowl champs. No arguments there. We all know the Kansas City Chiefs are really good and right now are the front runner to not only come out of the AFC next year, but also to win the Super Bowl. The Baltimore Ravens are on that level as well. I mean, they're not on the same level as the Kansas City Chiefs, but I think by far and away right now, after what Lamar Jackson and that team did last season, they're the clear number 2 seed in the AFC right now. And if anyone was going to pick a team not named the Kansas City Chiefs to come out of the AFC, it would probably be the Baltimore Ravens. But after that, this is also a discussion I've had on this show a bunch. Who do you guys think is the third best team in the AFC right now? Call me crazy. I think if the Buffalo Bills had above average quarterback play and they had quarterback play that I trust, I would consider picking the Buffalo Bills as to be on that same level as the Kansas City Chiefs or the Baltimore Ravens. I think their GM, Brandon Beane, has done a great job building that franchise. And I think that franchise and the way it's built right now is ready to win at every position besides quarterback. I think Devin Singletary is ready to become a top 10, top 12 type running back in the National Football League this season, especially after what I saw from him down the stretch last season. They bring in Stephon Diggs, who's going to be an established number 1 receiver. They have a young tight end in Dawson Knox that's really good. They have a really good offensive line, and they have one of the best defenses in football, including a secondary that is just criminally underrated with Trey White, Jordan Poyer, Micah Hyde. I think the pressure's on Josh Allen in that sense. I think around him, the Buffalo Bills are ready to make a deep, deep playoff run. The only issue is, at the most important position, I don't think they're ready. Just another interesting thing I decided to bring up during this segment. So when I'm evaluating quarterbacks, and you guys know this, I'm not that big of an analytics guy. Usually I judge my opinions on quarterbacks based on what I see with my 2 eyes. But there are 2 stats that when I'm evaluating quarterbacks, I really like to look at as big important factors when I judge them. And those 2 stats are completion percentage and yards per attempt. Last season, Josh Allen had a completion percentage of 58% and 7.1 yards per attempt. That's not really good. The NFL average, like where you want to be, is around 64, 65%, especially these days when it's easier to pass the ball in the NFL more than ever. You look at Baker Mayfield last year. In really that same sense, he had a completion percentage of 59% and yards per attempt 6.5. So 6.5 yards per attempt. Just to give you guys an accurate comparison, my guy Kyler Murray of the Arizona Cardinals, and last year was his rookie year. Keep in mind that both Mayfield and Allen have been in the league a year longer than he has. Kyler had a completion percentage of 64% and a yards per attempt of 6.94. That's really good, and that's something you want from your quarterback. When I look at both Josh Allen and Baker Mayfield, both of those things are going to be stats that they have to improve on. And it's interesting. When you ask ultimately the question, who is under more pressure? I would say Baker Mayfield for this reason. I believe if Baker Mayfield has a bad season this upcoming year, I think there's a good chance that he could become the next Jameis Winston. And in the 2021 season, not have a starting job in the National Football League. They're kind of the same player. They both have big arms. They've both thrown a lot of interceptions. They've both played behind, really shot offensive lines. But now Baker's out of excuses. You saw last year when the Tampa Bay Buccaneers decided to bring in Bruce Arians. And even though Jameis did lead the league in passing touchdowns, he also led the league in interceptions. And once Bruce Arians and the Buccaneers saw, all right, with one of the best quarterback coaches in the NFL, this guy still couldn't limit the interceptions, that's a problem. And as we know, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers decided to move on from Jameis Winston. I'm not saying that Kevin Stefanski is Bruce Arians. He's obviously never coached been a head coach of a game during his NFL career so far, but we don't really know what he is as a head coach. And as bad as he could be, there's no way he's worse than what Freddie Kitchens was last year. So when you look at it from that sense, the Cleveland Browns should hopefully take a step up. But when you look at the Cleveland Browns' talent, both these teams' talent, they have arguments to be the third best team in the AFC, excuse me. I already mentioned the Chiefs and the Ravens at the top, but I'll say this. From a pure talent perspective, I think an argument could definitely be made that the Cleveland Browns are the third most talented team in the AFC. I think head coach and quarterback is kind of what's pushing them back right now, as both of those things are two question marks. But there's no denying the amount of talent the Cleveland Browns have on their current roster. Last year, we know it didn't work out. Freddie Kitchens was awful. Their offensive line was awful. But now, with those two things hopefully taken care of, the pressure is really going to be on Baker Mayfield, and it's going to be interesting to see how he does this season, because once again, I think if he doesn't succeed, I could definitely see a scenario in which the Cleveland Browns decide to move on from Baker Mayfield only a couple short years after they drafted him with the number 1 overall pick. And then when you look at Josh Allen and the Buffalo Bills, I do think Josh Allen is under a bunch of pressure. But I think if he has a bad season, the Buffalo Bills will give him one more year as their starting quarterback. But everyone loves Josh Allen and everyone loves the Bills. And I haven't really heard a lot of people talking about the fact that if Josh Allen has a bad year, I do believe he could hold the Buffalo Bills back. I think they're ready to win at every position besides quarterback. And even though Josh Allen was okay last year, I still didn't see anything that made me believe that he could lead that team to a Super Bowl. I think the Buffalo Bills right now have like 9-7, 10-6 written all over them. I think their formula and the way they play is a really good formula to win in the regular season, but not in the postseason, because in the postseason, you need that star player to just make plays. And last year in the playoffs, it was Deshaun Watson and not Josh Allen. And if Josh Allen isn't that guy, I think the Buffalo Bills and the way they play, they're just not built to win in the playoffs. And I think we saw that in the back end of that playoff game against Houston last season. So ultimately, I'm going to ask you guys this. Which quarterback do you guys think is under the most pressure going into next season? Baker Mayfield of the Browns, Josh Allen of the Bills, or is there any other quarterback that you think could be in real danger of losing their job? It's going to be interesting to see, but I just find it fascinating that I think both of these young quarterbacks who were drafted in the same year are under a bunch of pressure, but most fans throughout the National Football League look at them in two different ways.